Hey folks, it's Bear Gardner. It's January 2025. Hey, I didn't say 2024, which is a minor miracle with me at the minute because I still can't get my head around year changes. And it's balance patch time, and this one might get spicy. Anyway, I am, as ever, a Cards content creator, a member of the Cards Contributor program, a regular streamer. You can find all my stuff, links, things, you know the drill by now. Support me on Ko-Fi or, send me a Twitch sub if you can manage to do so. It does make all of this more possible. Right, updates. One, if this is a slightly weirder video, part of that will be that I'm not 100% sure of my own audio levels at the moment because I'm currently deaf in one ear. Don't worry, it's temporary. Secondly, a declaration before we get into this, because it's balance patch time and it's the first time I've done one of these since it happened. I am currently involved in Cards internal testing for 1939. It is not a paid role, however I am restricted by an NDA, which means if some of my wording is a little bit different this time around, it's not anything to do with me trying to wiggle around anything or change the way that I approach this. I still want to make a balanced and incredibly kind of open review of what I see in a balance patch, but there are some things I'm restricted on and I have to be quite careful because I don't want to break an NDA because we don't want to go there. Anyway, so Blood and Iron has happened. Christmas, New Year, new tournament structure announcement, all that stuff. Stay tuned at the end. We'll cover that too. But we're going to hit the balance patch first because that's the thing I'm going to probably have the most to say on. So, January balance patch. So, balance patches happen fairly regularly in this game. Each of those balance patches basically consists of the devs making some tweaks to cards, making some changes to text or effects to rebalance anything that's causing problems or adjust things that perhaps need either buffing or reducing in the way they work. Right, great, so far so good. So this balance patch has already, as of time of looking at this, it's only been out for like 2.5, 3 hours, has already caused much stir in the community. There are many, many opinions that are going to be very specific on it, but we're going to get to those. And yes, before you ask, we will address the elephant in the room at the end of the balance patch, which is one of the things that isn't addressed in the balance patch, and my thoughts. But, okay, without further ado, I'm going to hop over and we're going to take a look at the balance patch directly. I'll go through, as usual, kind of the changes and tell you what I think. Alright, it's a balance patch. Usual deal, we've got the usual spiel. Hello friends, as is our custom, we have a balance patch in the month following a big expansion. The intention with these patches is to address any major balance issues following a great upheaval. Big expansion, yada yada. This time around, kind of sorted already with that because they did a patch before the Christmas World Championships. This is true, we have already had a balance patch before Christmas, so timing is a little odd, so this is probably not going to be as big a patch as some have been. And there is the thing here, the meta is kind of, the statement here is that the meta, in fact, let's highlight this statement. Let's do this. Right, the meta is fairly healthy with many different decks and strategies viable, and the best decks being only slightly better than the rest. Right, okay, so yeah, yes and no. The meta is quite diverse at the moment. There are quite a few different archetypes out there, but as you get further and further up to the top and the higher win rates, that, as always, will narrow down. What I will say is that, and I have just completed, you can see the VODs either here on YouTube eventually when they get uploaded and over on Twitch, I've just completed my new player run for Blood and Iron, so I started a completely fresh account and made it Field Marshal free to play. Definitely did see a lot of diversity in decks and got to play a lot of different bits and pieces and have some fun on the way up. So yes, diversity is a thing in the game. As ever, as you narrow up to the upper ends of ladder and particularly competitive stuff, that becomes less true. You will always get tightening down to certain decks that are just incredibly consistent or, bluntly, on vogue with the players who are playing them. But actually, this is a relatively fair statement at the moment. We are at least seeing some diversity, although there are some more heavy visibilities that people will have noticed. But, as always, that doesn't mean they're not going to make any changes, so let's just cut to the chase and look at what changes they're making. Okay, so the first change is to C Embargo, and this will surprise absolutely no one. It certainly doesn't surprise me. C Embargo has been an unbelievably potent tool in any Brit Air deck for a good while now. It is very, very strong, it is very, very effective, and it's getting a nerf, but it's not getting a huge nerf. But it's getting a more impactful nerf than it looks like at first. So obviously, on the face of it, you can look at this and go, alright, so we're losing a point of defence. Big deal. It actually kind of is. It does stop those early Brit Air units, Gladiator and Swordfish, we're looking at you, from going to 5 defence, which is a particularly irritating and awkward number for trading in the early part of the game. The actual effect hasn't changed, it's still got the potency behind it, the cost is still the same, this is still a very good card, but I personally like the change. I'm a Brit Air player, I play an awful lot of Brit Air, and I am not sad to see this nerf. I think it's very needed. I think it'll be interesting to see if this nerf is enough or whether we still see a proliferation, but at the moment I think this is actually quite a fair nerf. It is just toning it down, and toning down is fine. It doesn't need nerfing into the ground because it's kind of a central point of it, and there is still the pseudo-random element where you only see 3 cards and pick one, so overall I'm actually really happy with this as a change. Not got a problem with it, think it's going to be absolutely fine. It just makes Brit Air that little bit less sticky with the early units, and if you've played a lot of matches into Brit Air, you will realise that sticky early units are a serious problem. Okay, so this is another one that is going to come on the list of who'da thunk it. So, Calliope. So this beast has dropped and has done so with fury and sound and thunder since it landed. This card is insane. Callie is bonkers. It's an incredibly strong card. It has seen a huge amount of play, and for very good reason. It is incredibly versatile, incredibly effective. The change is okay. I am still not convinced it's enough. I still think this is a ridiculously good unit. I still think it's ridiculously good value. It does make it a little bit more subject to removal, which is a good thing, because Lord knows you need to answer this beast before it starts rolling. But this is still a very, very strong card. Honestly, I'm kind of okay with this, though, as a first pass nerf. I think this card can and perhaps will be adjusted further in future, depending on how much impact this actually has, and I'd rather see the card, certainly a card like this, driven down to being a bit less proliferate than nerfed into absolute obscurity, which is something I always don't want to see, because once you nerf something into obscurity, it's really difficult to get anyone to ever play it again, no matter how many times you buff it. Trust me, seen it many times over the years. So I'm kind of okay with this as a change. I am, however, of the opinion that this probably won't be the last change we ever see to Calliope. But right now, it does make her just a tiny bit easier to deal with, which is a good thing because, again, really good card. Right, compromise. It's a mill nerf. Many people will be incredibly happy to see this. Let's talk a little bit about why this is an important nerf. So, mill is not necessarily going to be being nerfed because it is unbelievably good and has an incredibly high win rate and is dominating the meta. It's going to be adjusted regularly because mill, like force discard, this is force overdraw, but forcing your opponent to discard any of the, like, heavy, your opponent doesn't get to play the game decks, always need to be pruned on a regular basis to make sure that they do not creep their tiny little selves into tier 1 and become dominating. Because the problem with a deck like this is at tier 2, which is where I personally think Mill sits, unless you're a very good player at the moment. Note, if you're a very good player, it's a different question, but the number of players who I would actually rate as that good is small. But at tier 2, a deck like this is frustrating, irritating, but something that someone who enjoys that kind of control can play without meta warping. If this sort of thing ever gets to tier 1 and becomes heavily competitive, the problem is it usually becomes the only competitive deck because it's very hard to answer with anything else, because it has the ability to just say, no. By the way, no. Oh, you've got a different tactic. Also, no. And now discard all your cards. Or overdraw, I should say. Anyway, so the change here is, on the face of it, very small. It's an increase in cost. This is actually not as small as it looks. One of the things that Mill struggles with is it can be very slow and it can present awkward turns to play, even if you're very good with it. And the difference between 3 and 4 when it comes to evening out your turns isn't small. However, I will say, collectively, Mill is probably still quite good and better than I would want it to be, because there are an awful lot of very good stall tools available out there that can lift Mill past the problem. So, yes, this is a bigger nerf than it looks like. Yes, I thoroughly approve of this nerf. I cannot but have no major problem with it. I think it is a well-considered choice. It is better than playing around with the text on the card, which, honestly, it's not the text on the card, it's the way that the card can be used and how efficiently it can be played that makes Mill potent. Or you end up just brutalising the card to being totally unplayable, which some people might see as a pro, but we are in a game where we want, and I'll be reminding people this on a regular basis, we're in a game where we want a diverse group of players who enjoy different types of decks to be able to enjoy themselves. So on the whole, I'm kind of okay with this. I think it's a decent change, it does slow Mill down, and I know with some confidence that eyes will be kept on whether it's enough to just trim things down. Overall, pretty positive, good change, not really a lot to argue about. Alright, let's raise a glass to a card that I am so very fond of. Actually, no, let's not, because I have been one of the people who has been talking about this card in very different ways and for a very long time. So, for those who don't know, I am generally accepted to be a particularly good Exile Air player. I have a very good win rate on the deck. I have a reputation for being very effective with it. So I know this particular card very well, and I have spent an awful lot of time reminding those people who think that this card is the only reason that Exile Air is good why they're wrong, and why Exile Air wouldn't be as consistent as it is if one card, of which you can only have 2 copies, is the only way that it wins. However, Hammer Home has been bonkers. It is an incredibly strong card. And this is a perfectly reasonable nerf. Legitimately, it's fine. It's a perfectly fine nerf. The card is still really good. It's still giving you another unit, and giving both of the units better stats, and reducing the operation cost. It's just less obscene than it was, and that's a good thing. Now, one thing that is probably going to get asked, and I think it's something that people will wonder, is how does this land? Like, Exile Air's not, like, everywhere, dominating the meta, stuff like that. Hypothetically, we can only resort to supposition because we do not have data access. But I would imagine that one of the reasons for this would be that the likelihood is that someone somewhere is keeping an eye on just how effective this deck can be and thinks, is it maybe getting to the point whereby if anyone figures it out, it might get a bit too good? Jet Air, anyone? Although this wouldn't be quite as bad, but anyway. Overall, I think this is a very healthy change. I don't think it destroys the deck for those who are like raising a glass to the death of Air Exile. Nah, I don't mean to disagree with you too heavily, but Air Exile is still going to be a decent deck. This just slows it down a bit. Again, that's perfectly healthy. Despite the fact that I am a massive Air Exile fan, do not lament this change. I think it's very fair. It's very even-handed, and honestly, probably good for the game. Right, so we're done with nerfs. That's it. Those are all the nerfs we're going to see. I know. Trust me. Stick with me. There's 2 words on many lips right now. I know, I do. We're on to the buffs, and the first buff is to 57th Rifles. Now, there are a couple of buffs in this that are T-34 aimed. Specifically, they seem to be aimed at T-34 Tribal. So, brief overview. The T-34 support that came out with Blood and Iron was really cool. But many of the tools that were lifting that archetype and making it an interesting tribal archetype ended up being a lot better if you just played them with different Sov armor units. Su-76, we're looking at you. In particular, this is the 12th Mechanized, which has become an incredibly effective way of reinvigorating Soviet play. Such a good card. It could have been a big buff to the T-34 Tribal deck, but the problem is that it was also a massive buff to every other deck that's running it, and there are better ways to use it. And there are lots of people who are very excited to have a true tribal deck in the game. There are always going to be people that like that because they enjoy that, and I think that's healthy and positive. I am of the opinion that it's actually a good sign that 1939 have recognised that those people are out there and are keeping an eye on whether there is a way to just give T-34s a little bit of a push so that it isn't just the red-headed step-cousin of a better Soviet armour deck. This change to 57th is actually quite meaningful. Getting this out a credit earlier is not nothing, because the effect on your T-34s that follow means that a T-34 dropped on turn 4 now can have a lot more impact if you have a way of dropping a T-34 cost-wise or otherwise on that turn. It's altering the way, it's kind of smoothing out the curve early on in the game of the tribal T-34 deck. But specifically, and notably, that's all it's doing. It is very focused, which may be odd to some people, and certainly isn't a meta-defining change. This is not going to single-handedly twist the meta. It's just going to make the T-34 tribal deck somewhat more viable. How much more viable, we'll see when people get their hands on the new tools and start playing with them. Speaking of, Turning Point. This is another T-34 change, T-34 specific change, and it is quite meaningful. So this card's got quite a big buff, because this card now allows your T-34s to operate for free for a turn. Now, one of the things that does slow down T-34 as an archetype is the operation cost, because unless you've managed to proc the one or more of whether it's a Moor or the other unit or both that reduce tank operation costs, T-34s are very, very slow. This gives you a burst turn, and a burst turn in which excess damage is not wasted. It goes to the enemy HQ. This is a very strong swing turn. Is it world-breaking? Probably not, but it has the potential to be very good, and it certainly lifts Turning Point to a card that you're more likely to look at and might make you consider T-34 over a more generic armour deck because they don't get this huge swing. On the whole, I quite like these two changes in T-34's direction. I don't know whether they're strictly necessary. They're certainly not meta-definingly necessary. But they are interesting and do have the potential to nudge a deck which, frankly, is in need of a nudge. But I mean, that's all I've really got to say on it. I'm not going to rant about it. It's a strong change, and we'll see how it plays out. Okay, so this is a bit of an odd one on the face of it. This is the 845th, and it's just getting extra point of defense. Why? Why? So, why, in theory? Because it gives this a better chance of getting 2 bites or 3 bites at the cherry, depending on when you've played it down, and therefore you can proc the extra HQ defense more times, which is fine. It does make this a decent-ish anti-aggro tool, but I do say decent-ish anti-aggro tool because this is also just a good tool in general, and it does kind of sort of buff Soviet control decks that want to run this card too. I'm not lit on fire by this change. I'm also not offended by this change. It's nice. It takes a card and makes it a bit more usable, which I'm usually pro. I just personally am of the opinion that there are some other cards that could have been also made more usable if we're going in that direction. And I'm not 100% sure that this is addressing anything super specific, other than, as I say, trying to give Soviet armor decks or Soviet value decks a way of stalling out aggro more effectively. But hey, just my opinion. On the whole, it's certainly not a change I can argue with, and it does make this a much more attractive card. That 1 point of defense is not nothing. Being able to get any kind of extra proc out of a card like this that is going to allow you to gain more defense, got to be a good thing. Especially remembering that the whole overlap thing, when this unit is dealt damage, not up to its defense. So if your opponent has to hit this with, I don't know, a 3 attack unit, and then next turn has to waste a 7 attack unit on it because they have nothing else to swing with for some reason, it's a whole 7 points of HQ defense. I mean, that's a very extreme thing, but this is kind of the point of making it have that little bit more of a soak, and I do get that. It does make this card significantly better. So, let's talk Throp. So Throp has kind of landed 3-op, by the way. The 3-operation cost-based deck that is basically US-France has dropped and has some potential. I played around with it, had some good win rates with it, but it does stall out and has some issues. It hasn't been hugely impactful. It's not grabbed anyone's attention. And this is an attempt, quite openly stated, that this is an attempt to try and give it a little bit of a jump, and the way they want to give it a jump is to give this unit Blitz. Now, this is a very funny thing, because this unit with Blitz switches from being an early game unit that you kind of plink down, and then slowly build up until you can find a way to reduce its op cost or mitigate it with Michigans, and then start doing things with it, to a card which you kind of want to be playing on turn 5 and pushing forward. Except you sort of don't, because you also sort of want to be able to deploy a unit and add its operation cost, which means you kind of really want to be playing it on turn 6 or credit 6 or credit 7, because you kind of want to be able to get some buffs onto this for it to be able to do anything, because it's only got 1 attack at base. It's an interesting change to an interesting deck that I want to explore more, but I don't think in and of itself this is going to lift Throp into the stratosphere. I think Throp needs more tools. Personal opinion. I think it needs a greater variety of tools to become at its most potential. But I mean, that's been true of any new archetype that you introduce into a game with a limited card pool. You usually end up needing to wait a little bit for it to settle in and get some more tools, or for people to find out ways to use other tools with it. But on the whole, I actually quite like this change. It does give Throp an interesting mid to late game aggressive play, whilst at the same time this thing can still have value as a turn 2 drop that just grows. You don't have to blitz it. So yeah, actually, as a change goes, I quite like it. I'm quite pro this change, but I don't think it's going to be meta shifting with regards to how Throp is performing in the meta. But hey, I don't want to dwell on this too much. We've got plenty of stuff to talk about. Okay, so here's another change that could have why written all over it. This is another kind of out of the blue change that I think a lot of people will be very surprised to see. Even I'm raising an eyebrow. It does shock me as a change. I did not expect it. The 5th Regiment is a major part of self-credit denial, and has been since the beginning, and it was one of the reasons that self-credit denial was bonkers good when it first landed, and then got nerfed into obscurity. And then became kind of a OTK generating meme. They're walking it back. Not completely. This is still less ridiculous than it used to be. In point of fact, this is one of the fixes that I myself suggested, as did other people, back when there was a problem with SKD, which is reducing the defense buff on the card. And that's exactly what they've done, and I therefore wholly and entirely approve of the change. I just didn't expect to see a self-credit denial buff. Honestly, I'm quite happy to see one, because it gives the chance of maybe giving the deck a nudge back into actually seeing some play. Because honestly, for a while, self-credit denial was really quite good. So I'm pretty up for this. And obviously, I'm not going to argue with a change that I personally was advocating for. That would be fairly kind of poor form, honestly. But yeah, I mean, it's a surprise. I know many people will be surprised of this. But honestly, take a breath if you're completely surprised at this, and just, it's never a bad thing to see some more diversity being thrown out, especially at the moment. I think diversity is healthy. So yeah, I'm actually looking forward to playing around, getting in game and playing some self-credit denial. Alright, so this is another kind of nudge type change, and we're seeing a few of these. This is another unit that was hoped to be something. Clearly, this was hoped to be a big part of encouraging Germany-Italy 4 attack as an archetype. But it didn't really land because, frankly, it's made of paper. And now it's made of slightly less paper. It's a bit more cardboardy, which is, apropos given we're playing a card game. But all puns aside, one extra defense here is not an insignificant buff to this card. I think some people will probably try this if they want to try and get the 4 attack thing working. It's a healthy change. It's a small change. It's another one of, as I say, the kind of the nudges that we're seeing in this patch, and this is a very gentle nudge balance patch. Anyway, that's really all I've got to say. Let's see how it plays out. Now, this is a change I personally really like. I actually think this is pretty smart. This is taking... Again, this is an unexpected change. Many people will probably not see this coming, and I think it's very cool that it happened. This is taking a card which, frankly, had landed into absolute obscurity, and making it a valid part of the 4 or greater attack deck theme, while changing basically nothing about the card. Like, this is just, it's a neat little change. Reduce the buff, increase the 2 base stats, net result, this works in 4 attack or greater, whilst at the same time being just a good value drop fighter. I love this as a change. I think it's really quite interesting. I kind of look forward to playing around, and also this plays into figuring out a way to either be more aggressive or find a way to leverage HQ in diversity, finding a way to manage your HQ defense versus the opponent's HQ defense in a way that leverages in your advantage, which I personally think is interesting. I like this change, wasn't expecting it, kind of came out of nowhere, but I think it's genius. I really do. Right, that's it. That's the balance patch. That's everything that we've seen. And before everyone explodes, we need to talk about first responders. Right, it's very rough and ready, but here it is on the screen, because, as I say, we do need to talk about this. This is first responders, and this is a card that I know many people were expecting to be changed in this balance patch, and I was one of them. So the change to first responders has resulted in this card seeing an enormous amount of play in varying decks. It has become a very well played in any Brit-US ramp combination in either direction. It is played in any control deck that runs Britain. It is played in a number of weird and wacky other decks, up to and including the Kangaroo Transport OTK deck, which I personally have had a lot of fun with this thing, and is generally viewed to be a bit silly. And I called this out, as did other people, when it landed as a change, that the reduction in cost to this card, which got us to where we are now, was a bit questionable. And it really has been. This card has become incredibly polarising, because it is incredibly strong. And many people were expecting to see a nerf to this card, myself included. Now, full declaration, I can't talk about what happened behind the scenes in balance patches and internal testing. I'm not allowed, that's what NDAs say. What I can do is give you my opinions on the card and my frustration that it hasn't been changed. I'm allowed to do that. Does the fact that this card has not been changed bother me? Yes, immensely. I'm going to get quite spicy about this card, because this card is in serious need of a change. The change, however, and I recognise this, I recognise that it is difficult to figure out a good change to this card that does not result in it either going into utter obscurity or really not altering its level of ridicularity. There are a number of good ideas out there. I have a number of very good reasons why I can't talk about them. But there are decent changes that can be made to this card to cap its effect in some way, and they need to be made. This card is very silly, not specifically because this card is just utterly broken. It is very vulnerable to removal. There are various forms of remove low-cost card that can just blow this thing out of the water, and you can suppress it and all of that stuff. Yes, that is true. But, 1, this card is common. 2, this card has so much impact because of the way it works. The fact that it can operate on the turn you first have it, because it's a countermeasure and that's the way it's intended to work. By the way, to all of those of you who... there are many people out there who've been saying stop it being able to operate the turn. Unfortunately, that would completely and utterly remove the card's usefulness and it would just never be played. That is not a good solution to this card. I will just say that. There are other things that could be done with this. That is not a good solution. But something does need to be done with it, because it is bonkers and it is incredibly debilitating and very negative player experience, especially for newer players. This card can be devastating to players who are newer to the game and can give them the impression that there is just a complete lack of imbalance, because this combos with the fact, and again I'm giving you the rant from the point of view of the I don't know, whatever you want to call me, the talisman, the advocate for the newer players. Early on in the game, you do not have that much in the way of good removal that's consistently available, and cards like this are incredibly annoying. Now, some of them are fine. This particular one, though, especially when it has the potential to be so bonkers in a meta where going wide, where big unit presence is actually being encouraged, only makes this sillier. So yes, I am in fact really quite animated and annoyed about the fact that this card hasn't been changed. However, I don't believe that means this card won't be changed. I do believe that there is the figuring out of a good change that is not nerf it into the ground because we hate the fact that slow decks exist, destroy it because it gets in the way of X, make it terrible. Those aren't good changes for a card. Rotation not an option in a balance patch. But yeah, straight up to all of you who are frustrated, you're not alone. There are plenty of people out there that are sharing the frustration with you. Yes, it is incredibly annoying that this thing hasn't been changed. It could do with some form of change. What that form of change is, that's for the future. I am very surprised that we didn't see a nerf to this card. And I am a little disappointed, not going to lie. Anyway, that's it. Rant over. I could go on about this for a very long time, but this video is getting longer, and I still want to kind of wrap up at the end of it and stuff. So I'm going to step away from this for now, but I said I would address it, and I have. This is probably the big elephant in the room, the balance patch. The fact that this wasn't adjusted is an issue. Right, so there it is, the balance patch and my point of view on first responders. Those are my thoughts. This is a very light touch balance patch, which is not wholly a bad thing. There is a big miss on the balance patch. I know there are other decks that were on the list. In particular, I know some people would like to see some changes to ramp. I'm kind of with them in that I think it would be interesting to see if it could be just toned down a little bit. A hashtag broken record. Please remove the B24s from the pool for everything other than production order and move on. I will say that endlessly because I think it's just a change that needs to happen. But overall, we got a light touch balance patch with a few changes that I think are pretty good. A couple of omissions, a couple of changes that are kind of way out of left field, but given that you have a balance patch in which you have openly admitted you've kind of already got the pre-Christmas balance patch and there's not that much that you're wanting to change, this isn't a bad time to throw some things out there, like the Sove kind of tweaks and the gentle pushing of the 4 attack kind of thing, then giving SKD a shunt, despite the fact that these aren't necessarily seen, and for that matter, the finally arriving nerf to Hammerhome. These are all kind of things that, I mean, if you've got the space to them, you should, but at the same time, why are we at this place whereby we're making all of these lovely tiny little changes? And I'm not in any way against those tiny little changes. I think I explained myself quite well. But we're not changing a card that is so irritating and polarising that there are endless posts of people pointing out that it's just frustrating their gaming experience and is in, frankly, need of a change. Don't know, it's a thing. Discussions will endlessly be ongoing, and of course there are other things to look at, and of course I will always say we don't have access to all the data. I have no idea what the actual overall win rate, win-loss rate, functionality rate of decks containing first responders actually is, so I am subject to my own confirmation bias, just like everybody else. So, I don't know, we'll find out. But yeah, I got a little bit spicy about the lack of a hit to first responders. Anyway, that's it for the balance patch. But before I go, let's take a look at the changes to the tournament structure for the coming year, because one, people have been asking me to do it, and two, I might as well do it all in one go because, hey, big video bonus, you get more bear. So stick with me, we'll hop over and talk about it. Right, here we are, the Cards esports changes. I'm not happy in some ways. I am not quite as unhappy as some other people, but I am frustrated. I will link down below to J King's video, which is very, very good and gives a very impassioned point of view from a competitive player. Notably, I am not an active competitive player. I am connected with the competitive scene. I have done testing with some competitive teams. I am still a member of Team Heavy. I have done content and all sorts around competition and mindset, so I'm not completely neutral on this, but I'm not as invested as some people. Anywho, the changes. So we are changing the number of competitive tournaments in the year, and this surprises no one. No one at all. Isn't a shock. With everything that we've seen coming down the pipe, it is clear that there is a need for 1939 as a business to kind of control their expenses on this and try and get more functionality. I'm fine with that. I'm not going to call them out on it because I understand, having been both sides of this in the gaming industry, the reality. But I am going to cast a brief but critical eye over the new structure. But first, because I have to, and I'm like, if you are the person from 1939 who wrote this article, and you're watching this, or you're from 1939 and you know the person who wrote this article, for what is about to come, please be aware this is a professional perspective. It is not meant personally. No offence is actually meant, but I have to talk about it because it's so annoying. This article, the actual text, the cadence, the content, the function of this article is terrible. It repeats itself. It is vague. It is poorly structured. It does not address points in the correct order that you do when you are communicating. And yes, by the way, I do feel comfortable talking about this because I have been in my life and still am from time to time a professional communicator in both verbal and interpersonal, but also written formats. I have written blog posts, I've written articles that have been submitted to the Sutting Royal Society. I have written articles that have gone out in different publications. I have written pieces for published works. I have written blog posts. I have written industry posts that are designed. I've written blurb for product. So I do in fact know what I'm talking about, and it really, really irked me when I read this how bad it was. Please, pretty please, 1939, I love you, and I want your game to succeed. Please invest in some good copy work. Get some freelancers who know what they're doing and get them to do your copy for them. Don't even remotely worry about it. You can get a good freelancer who writes copy, like myself, will write what you want them to write. They will give the information that you want them to give. They won't try and change it or twist it or argue with you. What they will do, though, is present it in a professional, clear and communicative fashion, and that's all of the things that this isn't. At all. Right, rant over. Mostly. Guess what? Some things really irk me in life. Bad writing and communication, especially in something as important as this, is one of them. Anyway, what do we actually get? Right, first of all, so we get the fact that we are only going to see 4 tournaments. We're going to see 4 seasonal tournaments and then the World Cup at the end of the year. So we get a total of 5 competitive tournaments in the year for actual cash prizes. I'm kind of okay with this as a format. I understand the need to cut down on the numbers. I hope that we're going to see some process and movement towards enabling more community-led tournaments, preferably using the new in-game tournament system and making it available to some creators and other kind of community leaders who might be able to host tournaments using that system because it would be cool. And there's a whole thing about finding a way to make spectator mode more consistent, effective, and available to people who want to use it. And please do that because we are going to need fill. But as an actual format, I don't naturally object to this. As someone who has been involved in various forms of competitive sports, I understand how a format like this can work, and I don't mind the actual structure, the base structure of this, but there are some holes and inconsistencies and problems. So let's dig in. Right, so we are going to see 4 tournaments. Those 4 tournaments will come basically directly after each release. So there'll be 2 expansions a year and 2 releases a year, and after each of those, the big shake-ups in the meta, there'll be a tournament. I'll get to that in a minute. I'm going to do the whole thing, then I'm going to try and holistically talk about this. Probably not going to make as much sense as I want to. Prize pool. So, there's money. The prize pool is $3,000. It's $3,000 split between 3 people. I don't like it. Sorry, don't. You need more than 3 people to walk away from money if a tournament's going to be hard to qualify for and require work and dedication, and spoilers, it is. And then you get some diamonds for everyone else. Fine, kind of, but you could probably do a lot better than 100 and 500 if you really want to reward people for doing this, given how brutal this is going to be, but I'm not going to get into the brutality yet, because I'm trying to go through this. A qualification, and this is where it gets interesting. So, to play in each of these tournaments, there are 3, in effect, qualification lanes. One is the same lane twice, and another is a separate lane. So, the same lane twice. For the 2 previous seasons prior to the tournament, as far as I can tell, but it is not spelled out or written as clearly as I want it to be in this article. Please rewind and see my rant earlier. I'm not going over it again, but this could have been so much better written. As far as I understand it, for the 2 previous seasons, the top 12 players, that's the top 12, it's not an insignificant point, from ladder in-game, that is, for those who don't know, that's when you reach Field Marshal, you then start on a whole new thing where there's an elo system and ladder, and it's explained in lots of other videos and discussed about, and you grind very, very hard to try and get previously into the top 34 or the top 32 to qualify for a tournament. Now you have to get into the top 12. Those top 12 people, and the top 12 people of the season before that one, so the 2 seasons prior to the tournament, are entered into the competition. That's a very small number of people grinding stupidly hard. That is very hard to do. Ladder grind is not easy, and this is indicative of a very competitive tournament, which is not necessarily a bad thing. The second string, effectively, the second line in, is that 8 players from the tournaments, again, this is so badly written it hurts my soul, but I will explain this as best I can. The tournaments means the season ladder, 1 season, presumably the season directly for, but again, it's not actually spelled out clearly in the article that that is the case, and yes, I'm getting agitated again, because if you're going to write this, take the time to write it well. Presumably for the 1 season prior to the tournament, the 8 players who have amassed the most tournament trophies, because that's what they look like on the board, points, will qualify. The way this works is that there are 2 tournaments in the game, Blitz Tournament and Iron Tournament, that award you these tournament points. The other tournaments do not. Those tournaments award Iron Tournaments, which are 300 gold to enter and quite competitive, award you 3. Blitz Tournaments, which are somewhat less competitive and cheaper to enter, award you 1. To be the top 8 in this, you will have to play a lot of tournaments. But, that's the problem. You don't have to be good. You have to be good enough to win. What you actually have to be is willing to play endless reams of these tournaments and happen to be somewhere in the world that falls in the window when these tournaments are open, which is limited. For example, for me, that's a non-starter, because by the time I would have the time to grind tournaments, they're closed, because I'm European, and who cares? Which is ironic, given it's a European company, but I will correct myself. There is a degree to which you do have to, and I respect that 1939 does have to focus on the bigger markets, and Europe is not the biggest market for this game. Be nice to see some more marketing initiative in Europe, because I actually think there are a lot of European card game players who'd very much enjoy this game. Anywho, the point being, you're going to have to just be willing to dedicate a ridiculous amount of time to spamming out tournaments, but it is only a time investment. There is no... The tournament structure there's no penalty for the number of times you lose tournaments, as long as you're willing to play 15 tournaments and whatever, or 100 tournaments in a month. The fact that you lose 40 of them or 60 of them doesn't matter if you win the other ones and they're the big enough numbers to get you to the top of the line. Yeah, it's not great. It's a bit Wild West, because really all it rewards is a willingness to dedicate time to it. But it does, in that respect, mean that someone who has one or two decent decks and wants to grind out tournaments can find their way into, like, in-game tournaments, can find their way to one of these seasonal tournaments, but then possibly get utterly obliterated. We'll get to that in a minute too. Anyway, before I overly get into analysing the issues with this, finally, qualification towards the World Championship, and this is way too short of a paragraph. So the top 3 players from each tournament will qualify directly into the World Championship, giving 12 players. The top 4 players from the previous World Championship, in this case 2024, also automatically get into it. As usual, it's been made clear that if someone double qualifies, then they'll work their way down numerically to people who haven't qualified. So if, for example, one of the top 4 from the World Championships wins one of these tournaments, then they won't get that qualifying place. Presumably the person who was 5th in the tournament, I'm not quite sure how that would work, would get in. But guess what? Once again, we don't actually say that anywhere. We're not actually communicating clearly how that works. Anywho, additionally, yada yada yada, top 4 players, and then we get additionally the top 4 players. I can't. I'm breathing, repetition, don't do it. If you were either the person who wrote this article or the person who edited this article, bad work. Not joking, very serious. There is no way that kind of error should even remotely make it onto a website, because the person who writes it should write a draft, then redraft, then submit the draft, then have the draft come back from whoever's above them, so that's at least 2 sets of eyes on it at least 4 times. Then an editor should go over it, which is a 3rd set of eyes, who is, by the way, a professional at noticing these things. And finally, someone actually uploads it to the website and might just go, hey, there's a repetition here, can I delete it? Nah! Anyway, ranty bear. Let's wrap up. So, why are people like me and James J. King getting so agitated about this? Because it's unclear and feels... I'm not quite sure the direction it wants to go. So, despite the fact this article tries to talk about creating a jump-in mentality, this is far from jump-in. If you are a newer player with a limited collection, or even a more veteran player who just doesn't happen to have a full collection and a lot of time to work on this, the structure of this, and J. King goes into it in great detail and in video and explains himself very, very well. Hit the link, seriously. We're not competitors. I like the guy, he's a friend of mine. We all make content, we all want to succeed, but he explains very well the fact that this structure is incredibly hard to qualify for. This is hard work. You are going to have to grind incredibly hard to qualify, and then you are playing into a tournament just after a meta shift, which means you're going to have to work your backside off to get consistent decks that you believe are good enough, and there's still the possibility that something weird will go into it, so it isn't going to be the tightly nuanced decks. Now, That isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it does create the possibility that we might actually see a more versatile group of decks and some kind of more innovative stuff, rather than just seeing something that's hyper needled down. I personally, over 30 years in card games, have played in a number of competitive events just after release of a new expansion, and they were so much fun. Whether they were draft format or constructed or any of the other things that they're so much fun to do. But I have never known that be the only tournament structure in a game, and I've certainly never known it be the tournaments that have the high payouts. Whether or not it works, I don't know. I'm not going to endlessly rant about this, but that is my concern. Is my concern about this. You can obviously watch this video, you'll hear about it, you can watch Jake King's video, see about that. You can also find the suggestions thread in the main Discord, where we have both made points, as have many other people. Anyway, it's time to wrap up, because this video has gone on plenty long enough. Right, wrapping up. Hopefully this has been useful and interesting. It's been a lot more hip-shot and probably a lot more impassioned than my videos usually are, because I'm doing this quite rapidly. I'm not 100% at the minute, and I'm doing about 500 other things at the same time. But it was important for me to get my thoughts out in a timely fashion. So, as always, thank you for watching. Thank you for being a part of it. Please join my Discord in the link below. Check out the rest of my content. Like, follow, subscribe, catch me on Twitch, support me on Ko-Fi. You know the deal. There's all the things that you can do to help the content coming. I'm not going anywhere. I'm still going to be around and giving you the best information I can. As always, stay well, be good human beings, and I will catch you next time.